we all have a set of security requirements that we need to be compliant with, right? There's no argument there. Everybody knows we have a set of security requirements that require compliance. But the problem that I've seen when I am working with organizations in the DIB, and this is not just a problem that affects the DIB, but we're here today to talk about defense requirements, is that regularly we see organizations implementing these controls in a way that might be considered compliant, depending on who you ask, right? But are certainly not secure, that are offering no real security value. We're going to call those initial implementations, the ones that don't provide any resistance to these specific types of attacks that we're going to talk about, we're going to call those compliance-focused implementations. Compare that with a security-focused implementation, which actually makes every step in this attack chain that I'm going to demonstrate here much more difficult, if not impossible. So that's the goal of this presentation, right, is to show you specific examples of how we can maximize the security return on our compliance investment by looking at how security-focused control implementations for CMMC can make my life as a penetration tester much, much more difficult. And this applies directly to the hackers who are attacking your company right now. So TTP number one, tactic, technique, and procedure. Number one, remember, we're following the same penetration testing process as a real hacker would use, right? So initially, these hackers are outside of your organization. We need to find a way in. Barring any really bad vulnerabilities, technical vulnerabilities at your perimeter of your network, right? If we patch our systems somewhat regularly, if there are no glaring holes at the edge of your network, right, this is the only way that we're going to get in. And this is the number one way that my team gets in. And I know everybody in here knows what social engineering is. Probably hear it from your organization a lot, that we shouldn't be clicking on links and we shouldn't be downloading attachments and all that stuff. So you're all consumers of social engineering. You know what it looks like when one of these emails hits your inbox. I'm a producer of social engineering, so it looks a lot different for me. First step in my process for social engineering, or our process on my team, is we buy a lookalike domain. We go out there and we find a domain that looks very similar to yours. The number one thing that we're going to look for, in general, is a different top-level domain, right? If you are company.com, we're going to go out and buy company.org if that's available. And if not, we're going to try a little bit harder. And there's all sorts of fancy ways that we can use characters from different alphabets and special characters and all sorts of things to make this really, really difficult to detect. Step two, we're going to clone a website. We're going to go out there on the internet and find your login pages, right? Hopefully it's your VPN. Maybe it's your webmail. Maybe it's a specific business application, something valuable. We're going to clone that website. Just the login page. We don't care about the application behind it. All we want to do is clone the login page and make it very, very convincing. And then we're going to stand up that website on our fake domain. Then we're going to send some emails, get people to click on some links, send them to our login page, and harvest their credentials. So this is what social engineering looks like from my end. There's a lot of different ways to go about it, but this is our standard practice right here. Step four is the fun one, because then we profit, right? We can go after CUI at that point. We're going to be, the idea here, at least for the purposes of this talk, is that after we successfully conduct TTP number one, social engineering, we have made a really big step. We have gone from the outside of your network, the internet as it were, to the inside of your network. In a lot of cases, the hackers are after money. Within the defense industrial base, maybe they're after our controlled and classified information. So now, let's look at a couple CMMC controls briefly, or NIST 171 controls really, that could provide resistance to social engineering if they're implemented in a way that is security focused. We're going to go through these pretty quickly. We're hopefully, most of the people in the audience are familiar with these controls, at least at a high level. Number one here is the one that we're going to zoom in on. We need to ensure that our users are made aware of the security risks associated with their use of our systems. This is what we'll call the training control, the broad training control. And you'll notice here that what it doesn't say, even though this social engineering is the number one way that my team and real hackers are going to break into your network, it doesn't say that we have to provide any training around social engineering. That doesn't exist in the standard. What it does say is that it's on the end organization to identify the risks and then provide specific trainings or at least make users aware of those risks. So we have to do a risk assessment, right? Did any of us actually perform a risk assessment when we're implementing this control? I tend to doubt it. And like John Ellis said earlier today, there's a million ways to implement any one of these controls, right? So this is the one that we're going to zoom in on from a control implementation perspective. But I wanted to bring up this second control here too, multi-factor authentication, because This is what I hear a lot, is that we're protected against social engineering, right? Because we have multi-factor authentication. On all the services at our perimeter have multi-factor authentication. And that's great. Multi-factor authentication is a really powerful control. It really is. It's a deterrent control from my perspective. From a hacker's perspective, a pen tester's perspective, it's a deterrent control. That means it makes my job harder. It's not preventative, but multi-factor can be bypassed. There's multiple ways, depending on how it's implemented, to bypass multi-factor authentication, and that means we have to rely on our end users, right? We have to rely on our end users. They're our first line and our last line of defense when it comes to social engineering. So let's take a look at two different specifically, control implementations for our training requirement. One of which is compliance-focused. This is our compliance-focused control implementation. If your implementation for user awareness training, this 3.2.1, is to have all of your end users read and sign off on a set of policies and procedures, even if this policy includes specific statements around email security, right, and social engineering and things like that, you have a compliance-focused implementation. And this implementation is not necessarily preparing your users for real life. What does a security-focused implementation look like? Well, this is one example, right, is realistic ongoing phishing campaigns where you're actually trying actively to phish your users, showing them what real phishing emails look like, convincing phishing emails look like, and providing actual training and feedback for whoever fails. So I want to make it clear at this point in the conversation here that I'm really not here to advise on what is a compliant implementation and what's not a compliant implementation. I'm trying to provide information as to whether or not a given implementation is a secure implementation. So that's really where we're going to focus here, is whether or not these implementations actually address the underlying cybersecurity risk. All right, so at this point, you had a compliance-focused implementation, unfortunately. So now I'm inside your environment. I am on the internal network at this point because I phished a user, I got their VPN credentials, maybe I bypassed multi-factor authentication, and in any effect here, I am on your internal network. What am I going to do next? Our second TTP here is protocol abuse. This is going to get a little bit technical on this one, but it really is the number one thing that any hacker, any attacker, any penetration tester is going to do on your internal network, so it's important that we cover it at a high level at least. So I'm going to walk through what one of these attacks actually looks like. Remember, I'm on your internal network at this point. That's me. I'm the little red box at the bottom there. I'm the attacker. And here's a regular old user on your internal network. So the technical bit here is that we have to understand really high level what DNS is, domain name services. And at the highest level, it is a system on your network, and every one of us usually has a DNS server on our network somewhere. And that server's only job, that system's only job, is to translate names, computer names, you could say, into IP addresses, right? Humans use names to address our computers. Like if we want to connect to a file share or a website, we're going to use a name, www.website.com. But computers, they don't understand that. They don't know names. They only know IP addresses. So the DNS server, its only job in the world is to keep a mapping of names to IP addresses. Every time you make a request on your system, every single time, your system, on your behalf, is going to generate a DNS request, and it's going to ask your DNS server, hey, my user wants to make a request to this website or to this file share. Can you please translate the name that they typed in to an IP address so I can help them get there? So that's what happens. Let's simulate that. I make a request. I'm trying to connect to a file share, but I mistyped the name, files forever, folder. That doesn't exist on my network. I just fat-fingered it when I put it in. So consider the fact here is that this DNS query is going to fail. DNS query failed. Imagine all the different ways, it's easy for me, it might be harder for you, but that a query like this could fail in your network. A user types in something incorrectly. We have file shares out there that no longer exist. We have entire systems that have been retired, but systems like other workstations on your network are still requesting that system automatically in the background. Applications that have gone away, dangling DNS records, all sorts of things out there can create failed DNS queries, and that's what this entire attack hinges upon. Because in a perfect world, in a world where we have addressed this vulnerability, this is where the process stops. Your query fails, you are not able to connect to that system, and that's correct, right? That system doesn't exist. So Unfortunately, that's not what happens. Thanks to these two legacy protocols, old protocols that are built into the Windows operating system called Link Local Multicast Name Resolution and NetBIOS Name Service. Those are alternatives to DNS, and they're enabled by default on every single operating system, every Windows operating system in your environment, unless we've chosen to turn them off specifically. And this is what happens if those are still enabled, which in general they are. Instead of this process ending right now with a failed query and the user hopefully realizing that they typed in the name wrong, that workstation is going to automatically, without any interaction from the user, ask every other system on the network, where is file server/folder? My DNS server couldn't find that system for me. Can anybody else on my network, my local network here, can anybody else help me find that system? Does anybody else know where it is? So herein lies the problem. These are multicast protocols, which means that request goes out to everybody on the network, the local network that is. The problem with this is that I'm on the local network, and I can respond to that request. I can say, I'm that system. I am file server. I am hosting that folder that you need to connect to, so you should connect to me. And this is all passive. None of this is happening. There's no user interaction except for the user trying to get to where they're trying to go to connect to that file share. This is all happening in the background. And critically, I can tell that system automatically during that response that if you want to connect to this folder, you need to authenticate. And your system is going to automatically spit out a hash, a password hash. This is an encrypted form of your user password on your network. So it is encrypted. It's not just your plain text password, right? We do have to do some work with this. However, without any user interaction, we can almost always, once we're on the internal network, we can steal user credentials using this technique. And this is the #1 internal tactic, technique, and procedure that we use. So now we are in the compromising user accounts phase. So what can we do with this? This is a hashed password. That means it's encrypted. One, we can take it offline, right? Feed it into our very powerful password cracking rig and try to crack it. If your users are choosing poor passwords, then we will crack it, and now we can become that user. What we generally do is relay this hash. So we can spit this hash right out to the network again. The second we see it, we spit it right back out to the network, and we try to authenticate to other systems as that user. And that's called, pass the hash. And that's a very, very valuable technique as well. And it all hinges on these legacy protocols. Because if this DNS query failed and the whole process stopped right there, this multicast name resolution request, the orange lines right there, would have never happened, and I never would have heard them on the network, and I couldn't have responded to them, and I couldn't have solicited authentication. But I did. So let's look at some controls that could have prevented this. Configuration management. We need to establish and enforce security configuration settings for our systems. The problem here, that's a great control, right? It stands to reason that this could address the problem. The problem is that the standard doesn't tell us what configuration settings we need to implement. So it's left to the end organization to determine what those security configuration settings are. Configuration management, again, employ the principle of least functionality. Make sure your systems are only offering the ports, protocols, functions, and services that are actually required to support a business case. And I can assure you that in 99% of your environments, these protocols don't serve any purpose that we can call a business case anymore. They might have in the past, but not anymore. So let's look at a couple implementations for these two controls. Compliance focused. If your implementation for security settings, establishing and enforcing security configuration settings, is to establish and enforce the security configuration settings that are explicitly required by the 171 framework. So those ones that are actually explicitly called out, things like password policy, banners, session locking, all those really technical controls that are saying you need to do these very specific things. If you're selecting and enforcing those, and that's it, you have a compliance-focused implementation. What's a security-focused implementation look like here? A security-focused implementation looks like standing on an established benchmark. So why should we try to roll our own security configuration settings? I've already shown you that there are some features built into Windows that can be abused by hackers or attackers like myself, penetration testers, to steal user credentials on your internal network. It stands to reason that a secure implementation might stand on a known secure baseline. Somebody else has gone out and done the work on your behalf to produce a configuration guide on how we should be configuring our Windows operating systems, our Linux operating systems, Mac, network devices, all those things. Center for Internet Security publishes what are called benchmarks, and they're guides on how to configure these operating systems in a way that is secure. Similarly, other organizations do the same thing. DISA, Defense Information Systems Agency, publishes the STIG, if you wanted to go to that level of detail. And I'm showing you right here that from the benchmark, from the current Windows 10 benchmark and other Windows benchmarks as well, CIS is recommending, the Center for Internet Security is recommending that we turn off multicast name resolution. We turn off LLMNR, which is the primary offender for this specific attack type. For that other control, for the least functionality control, if your implementation for least functionality is building your workstations and servers based on a standard checklist, right? And we only install approved software, right? We have a standard checklist of software that we install in that operating system, and we don't install anything except that which is required. If that is your implementation for least functionality, then you have a compliance-focused implementation. We are not addressing the underlying cybersecurity risks with the other stuff that's turned on by default, specifically within a Windows operating system in this case. So a security-focused implementation here is standing on the shoulders of giants and leveraging someone else's hard work in determining how to configure an operating system in a way that is secure, rather than trying to roll your own security settings, because they know better than we do. And at this point, we're actually walking through a pen test right now, so that last attack was successful, right? Let's assume that it was. We could have either captured that hash, and let's consider it a regular old user account, right? We're not getting lucky at this point. It's not an administrative user account or anything like that. But at this point, I have at least one regular old user account on your network. We'll call that, a domain account. And for those who aren't familiar with the idea of an Active Directory domain, a lot of us in the room here today have one, whether we know it or not. An Active Directory is, the address book, one way to look at it, for your environment. It's the system on your network that handles all of your passwords and all of your authorizations to access different systems and all the groups on your network and things like that. It's a really critical system that handles authentication, among other things. But let's, for our purposes, we're going to talk about the authentication component here. So at this point, remember, I have access to at least one user account. Either I cracked that password by taking it offline and essentially guessing what it was using some really powerful hardware, or I relayed it to another system on the network. And I got lucky and I found a system where that person was a local administrator. I'm going to talk about that. And now, right, so at this point, I have at least one user account using this tactic, technique, and procedure. What are we going to do next? Now, I'm authenticated on the domain. I'm authenticated on the network. The next thing that we're going to do is try a really simple, on our end, kind of technical to discuss, method for privilege escalation. Privilege escalation means taking whatever existing user account I have and using it one way or another to gain additional permissions on the network, to gain additional privileges. Whether that means becoming a complete and total administrator over every system on the network, we'll call that a domain administrator, or maybe I just, access a couple more systems. Maybe I gain access to a couple more user accounts. In any case, we're going to try a technique called Kerberoasting. It's a dumb name. Hackers love dumb names. But this is a really pervasive attack type, and we're going to talk really briefly about what Kerberos is, just so we can get the kind of the high-level overview here. But what I want you to take away from this attack type is how dangerous it is in real life, and we should be asking ourselves, man, are we vulnerable to this type of attack? Because of how pervasive it can be. So Kerberos is essentially a way of logging into different services on the network. It's an authentication protocol. Instead of using a password to log into a service on the domain, a service on the network, rather, instead of typing in your password to every single thing that you want to log into, you could use, or your IT administrators could have configured Kerberos to perform authentication for that service. So think of, applications on the network, databases, file shares, depending. We can use Kerberos to authenticate to all these different things. Kerberos is, technically speaking, more secure because your password never actually goes over the network. Instead of using your password to authenticate, you will use what's called a ticket. You're going to get a ticket, and you can present present that ticket to the service, and the service will say, that is not a valid ticket, you may enter, or the service will say, no, that ticket is no good for various reasons, and you're not allowed to access the service. So we are authenticating with what's called tickets in this case, and that's basically all we need to know at this point. In an enterprise, all of us have services running at the network level. Almost all of us, at least. Things, like I said, like applications or databases, if these are authenticating, if we're logging into these different services, databases and applications and whatnot, at the domain level, at our, using our Active Directory credentials, essentially, these are services that are running on the domain, is what we'll call it. And if we have those, that means we probably have service accounts, right? We almost certainly have service accounts. And that's where the attack starts, is we're going to target service accounts. So this is, just a screenshot of us doing the attack. It doesn't look like much, but we'll talk about what all that stuff means real quick. This should come as a surprise, especially if you are an IT administrator in your environment, or security person in your environment, and maybe for everybody in the room. But did you know that any authenticated user on your network, any user, regardless of their level of permissions, if they have an Active Directory account, they can perform this attack? This is a feature, I'll put that in quotes too, a lot of quotes today, that is built into Kerberos. This is how Kerberos is designed, and we can abuse a feature that we'll talk about right now to basically ask your domain controller, that system on the network that performs all your authentication, really, really nicely. We can say, please, Mr. Domain Controller, will you please give me the encrypted passwords for any service accounts running on the domain? And because we have a domain account, and because this is built into the Kerberos protocol, the feature that we'll talk about what we're actually doing in 1 second here, your domain controller will spit out password hashes, again, they are encrypted passwords, still valuable, for services that are running on the domain. So that should come as a surprise. Any authenticated user on your domain, in your network, including computer accounts, it can be anything on the network, can request, essentially, directly request password hashes for any service accounts running on the domain. The reason this works is because of how Kerberos is architected. The tickets that we request when somebody is trying to use Kerberos the right way, we request a ticket, right? And the ticket, turns out that the ticket is encrypted with this password hash. So you get a ticket from the domain controller to log into that database or to log into that application. The ticket that you get is encrypted, so it's protected, but it's encrypted with the password hash of the user that set it up, built into Kerberos. Don't ask me why. But we can extract that hash, and just like we did in TTP number 2, tactic, technique, and procedure number 2, we can try to crack this hash. We can't relay this hash. We can't do anything with it except for try to crack it. So that's the only thing that we can do. And that means that your only protection, literally, your only protection against this, besides not having service accounts at all, is to have is your password controls, right? So we're going to be relying on password controls for this attack, for mitigating this attack, really. So what do the controls look like? I bring up number 1 here only to show, that the CMMC framework, NIST 171, is service account aware, right? It calls out service accounts specifically in more than one control. Processes acting on behalf of users, we'll call those service accounts. So we need to identify them, we need to authenticate them, things like that. At face value, it looks like we need to treat these accounts at bare minimum the same way that we treat user accounts or devices, right? They're all in that same control right there. So we need to treat them at a bare minimum as carefully as we do other accounts. But that's not really where it should end, and I've just shown you why, right? They pose a significant risk in an organization, not just because of Kerberoasting. Generally speaking, those accounts are administrative accounts. They have elevated privileges, at least somewhere, if not everywhere, in your environment. And I said that we can't relay that hash, we can't do anything with that hash, that password hash. I say hash a lot, it just means an encrypted password, right? Technically, it's an encrypted password. So the only thing that we can do with that is try to crack it. The only thing that we can do with it. So we are, and all of you, are really relying on 3.5.7 password complexity to protect against this attack. If you have service accounts in the environment that were set up by a general user, this is all we have to go on here, is our password strength. So what is our compliance-focused implementation? You could say, ooh, I have a group, an Active Directory, where I keep all of my service accounts. So I have them inventoried, and even past that, I have a standard naming convention. they all start with an S underscore. So it's really easy for me to identify my service accounts, and I can prove to you that they are authenticated because they all live in one group in Active Directory, right? If that's your approach for service accounts, and that's essentially it, you have a compliance-focused implementation. If your approach for the password complexity requirement is to implement the default Active Directory domain policy for password strength, or length rather, and complexity, 7 characters, 8 characters, whatever it happens to be in your environment, you have a compliance-focused implementation. 7 and 8 character passwords are dead, truly. From a pen tester's point of view, from a hacker's point of view, 7 and 8 character passwords can be recovered in seconds to minutes. We crack passwords, Kerberos passwords here with commodity hardware, right, at 5 billion per second. So we can guess 5 billion passwords per second. And that allows us to cover the key space. That means all possible variations of 7 and 8 character passwords in a very short amount of time. So if you have a 7 or 8 character password for your service accounts, you are entirely vulnerable to Kerberos. Kerberoasting, rather. What does the security-focused implementation look like? I said it's entirely reliant on password length and complexity here. So either you don't have service accounts that were set up by a standard user account and you rely on, more technical things like managed service accounts and stuff like that. But if you do, the only thing you can do to protect those accounts from Kerberos attacks, Kerberoasting attacks rather, is we need to implement a password length and complexity requirement that is not just enforced for every user account in the domain, but it should be commensurate with the risk of that account. I've shown you why these accounts are particularly risky. So it stands to reason that maybe we need a longer or more complex password requirement for service accounts, whether that's technically enforced or enforced via policy. People are not or should not be using service accounts interactively on a daily basis, logging into them, hands at the keyboard. Do we really need to remember these passwords? If the answer is no, why can't they be 25 characters long? If it's 25 characters, I'll tell you right now, we're not going to recover them during the course of an engagement, and a real hacker, I can't say with, certainty, but anything over 15, 16 characters and above makes it exponentially more difficult to recover, and we certainly will not recover them during the course of an actual penetration test. And that's what this means at number 2 here, resistant to offline cracking. I told you we crack at 5 billion per second for this specific type of hash. So you should take that away and understand that if you're not implementing password complexity and length in a way that is fine-grained, if you're using the same password policy for your CEO and your VIP users who need a small password for some reason, as well as your service accounts, who no one logs into ever interactively, no one needs to remember that password day to day, then you have a compliance-focused implementation. We really should be considering implementing password complexity in a way that is fine-grained. At least for privileged accounts, they should be longer and more complex, and service accounts are privileged accounts. All right, so at this point, that worked, right? I have access to a couple user accounts now. I might even be an administrator on a couple systems in your environment. What are we going to do next? I haven't gotten what I wanted yet. In this case, I want your CUI. I want your PII. I want your sensitive data. I want access to everything. I want to be an administrator in an environment over every system. Whatever the goal is, I haven't gotten there yet. So what we're going to do is what we always do, and this is more of a process than an individual attack. It's called lateral movement. What does lateral movement mean? It means using existing compromised accounts, and if I remember, I have at least 2 at this point, and finding other locations on the network where those accounts are not only valid, but administrative. They have administrative rights over those systems. So if I compromise one user account, I'm going to go find every single system on your network where that one user account is a local administrator. That means that they have administrative access, elevated rights to at least that one system. So we're going to do this with every account that we compromise. Why is this useful for us? Because this allows us to compromise that system. So we have a user account that's a local admin. We can use that account to search the file system for password files because everybody has a password file. At least that's how it seems to me. We can dump stored credentials. There are passwords and things like that stored on these endpoints, so we can dump those. If somebody else is logged into that machine at the same time, we can become them and steal their session. So lateral movement is an iterative process of identifying user accounts and compromising them, and then identifying systems where that user is a local admin, and then compromising that system and getting access to more user accounts, and then moving laterally with those user accounts, and just keeps on going and going and going until we get what we want. So this is what the meat of the penetration test looks like. We're compromising credentials and we're moving through the network, compromising additional systems and additional credentials as we go. The key point here is that these attacks leverage valid credentials. So we're not brute forcing, right? We already know the password to these accounts. We're already these users. We've already taken over these accounts. So we're not failing authentication in any of these systems. These are all successful authentications. And that's the key for this next part here. And this tool down here is just a screenshot of us actually executing lateral movement. And over in the corner there, it says pwned. And that means, hey, I'm a local admin on that system. Another dumb hacker term for that is now my system. And I can log into that system and I can do all those bad things and hopefully get access to more user accounts and continue moving laterally. So what are the controls that could have prevented this if we had implemented them in a security-focused way? Well, let's talk about number one here. One way of saying least privilege, we need to limit information access to those transactions and functions, the type of things that people need to do on that system, and limit that only. So that's the only thing that those people are allowed to do. Number two here, and this is the one we'll zoom in on, is to create and retain audit logs to the extent needed to facilitate investigation and security monitoring. 3.3.1 does not tell us what it is that we have to monitor for. It doesn't say exactly what audit logs we need to capture. It doesn't tell us precisely how to configure audit logging. It says it's on the end organization to determine what audit logs, what events on my network I need to log to facilitate my own monitoring and my own investigation. So again, there's a lot left to the end organization in interpreting this control. So let's look at two implementations here. We'll start with the bottom one because it's simple. If your implementation for least privilege, or the least privilege control we just talked about, limiting system access to authorized functions and transactions that users are permitted to execute, if you are giving everybody in your network local admin access, because it's the standard, or to support a business case, things like that, to lift the burden on your service desk, stuff like that, you have a compliance-focused implementation, right? Because if everyone is a local admin on at least one system, that means that every time I compromise a user account, I can compromise an additional system. And that means lateral movement is working, right? So we should be limiting local admin to where it's actually required. And obviously, that'll come up on the security-focused side. But what I want to talk about briefly here, I should say in more detail, is the audit logging requirement. So what this means here, if your implementation for creating and retaining system logs, that 3.3.1, the de facto auditing control, is to ensure that auditing is turned on. If that's your implementation, then you have a compliance-focused implementation. Because by default, Windows is not logging successful authentications locally. By default, your Windows operating systems will not write an audit log or an event that says somebody successfully authenticated to this system. That means that you will never see my hundreds and hundreds of successful authentications across your network. So if your implementation is to just make sure it's turned on and rely on Windows to do all the hard work of determining what is and what is not audited for you, then you have a compliance-focused implementation. What are the security-focused components here? If we had done this differently, what should we have done? Well, number one, I think it's clear now, we should maybe consider limiting local admin to where it's actually required, and I mean really required. And where it is required, maybe we should consider having them use a separate account, a dedicated local admin account. Local admin is the prerequisite for lateral movement. I need to be able to access your systems as a local administrator. Other things we can do, we can limit workstation to workstation communication. That's not addressed in the compliance-focused side, but I wanted to add it. Is there any reason that your systems need to communicate with one another? Laptops, workstations on your internal network? They need to connect to your servers and your file shares and your applications, but does one laptop need to talk to another laptop? In general, the answer is no. And if they can't, then lateral movement becomes much more difficult, because I only have access to very few corporate assets. But if I can talk to every other workstation on your network from one workstation, my compromised machine, then lateral movement becomes very valuable. And lastly, this is the important one, I think, just like I said that maybe we should consider implementing a standard, secure baseline configuration that is based upon somebody else's hard work. The audit configuration is a great example of this. CIS benchmarks, the same standard that we talked about of turning off those legacy protocols, if you had adhered to that baseline configuration or at least implemented those security requirements, you would have turned on auditing for successful authentication. And then you would have seen all these lateral movement attacks across your network. And the last thing I'll say here is that if you rely on the SIEM, if your answer to this whole spiel here is that I have SIEM, I have a monitoring tool that does all this for me. Like, it's magic. It's not, and I'll tell you why. The SIEM relies on the data that you send to it. So if you are not auditing these, and by that I mean logging, if you're not writing event logs for successful authentications, that data will never make it to your SIEM. And then your magic SIEM will never be able to alert on it. Your security team will never know what happened. So the SIEM is only as powerful as the audit configuration beneath it. All right, let's assume now, save the best for last, I think, that all of that failed. I was not able to access, any user accounts on your network. KERBEROASTIng didn't work. You guys have strong passwords. I know you do. Lateral movement doesn't work because maybe you guys limited workstation to workstation communication. Local admin is really well restricted. The only prerequisite for this attack, none of that matters. The only prerequisite for this attack is that I actually am on your local network. So at this point, social engineering had to work. This is going to take place on your internal network. So TTP number 1, tactic, technique, and procedure number 1 had to work. Everything else failed. All I have on your network right now is a system, is my own attacker system. I have an IP address and that's it. I don't have passwords, I don't have user accounts, I don't have data, I have nothing. And this focuses on the one machine that no one seems to care about. It's a printer, right? The lowest hanging fruit in your network. It's not the CEO's laptop, it's not the file server, it's not your Active Directory, it's not your development servers, it's not line of business applications. It's just a printer, so plug it in, forget about it. No one does anything with printers. Default credentials everywhere, in my experience. I have literally had IT administrators laugh in my face when I bring up default credentials as part of a security assessment on a printer, and I'll show you why it really is a risk. The only thing that that administrators tend to configure on the printer is scan to share, scan to email, those types of things, where we can walk up to the printer, we can scan a document, and we can have it automatically sent to a file share, or we can have it automatically sent to our email address, things like that. That's the configuration that we are going to abuse. And to do that, we require default credentials. But that's okay, because no one ever changes the default credentials on a printer. So we will find printers on your network, and we will log in with the default credentials, and we will go to your LDAP configuration, which is the place that the IT administrator configured the ability for that printer to scan to a share or to scan to email. They essentially have connected this server to your Active Directory, and we will reroute that authentication to us. So down the bottom here it says connection test. I'm just going to change the IP address of your Active Directory, and I'm going to send that authentication to my system on the network. And I click start, and boom, right on my system, I get your password. In plain text this time, actually, because we can configure all that stuff. So with no other prerequisites, with no access to your Active Directory and your user accounts and your file shares and things like that, we are still, by leveraging weak controls on a printer, able to, quote unquote, pass back authentication from that printer to our attacking system that's on your network. And now, in general, users are leveraging administrative accounts to set up their printers. Not sure why, and we'll talk about that. But in any case, without any prerequisites, failure of every TCP so far except for social engineering, we're still an administrator, we still have access to your CUI. So what are the controls that could have prevented this, depending on how they're configured, or implemented rather? We need to establish and maintain baseline configurations. It stands to reason that this control should apply to every system within the boundary of your CUI environment. That would include printers. Secondly, we need to employ the principle of least privilege. And we're going to zoom in on why this is a problem. The user who configured this printer chose to leverage their administrator account, their domain administrator account to do this. And therein lies the problem, because that is the authentication that we can pass back and steal the password for. So let's look at the control implementations here. If your implementation for printers as a component of your CMMC program is nothing, then you have a compliance-focused implementation. If we're not addressing printers at all, we have a compliance-focused implementation. We're hoping somebody doesn't ask the question. Maybe you have an inventory, right? I have an inventory, and on that inventory are my printers. If this is the sum total of your approach for printers, then you may very well be vulnerable to passback attacks. The security-focused implementation is to treat the printer like the other systems on your network, right? It's within the boundary of our CMMC environment, so it needs to be controlled, at least in accordance with the controls, we'll say. That means we should be implementing password controls around that system too. That means, in this case, specifically, changing default credentials everywhere, right? That should be a part of the baseline configuration for a printer, or at least the security settings we implement, right? Changing default credentials. I've shown you why default credentials on a printer are so risky. Least privileged. Never use a domain administrator account for anything except for logging into a domain controller, ever, right? That's the only system that should ever see domain authentication, domain administrator authentication. There's no need to use a domain administrator to configure a printer. And lastly, if you didn't know that there was a web interface on that printer, if you didn't even know that it existed, that you could browse to that printer in your browser, then you should disable it. All right, conclusions. Remember, did we ever exploit a vulnerability related to a missing patch? No. Misconfigurations, abusive features, poor password hygiene, that's all we did. I think I've shown that it's possible to be compliant without being secure, right? And CMMC should be about security. I think it's clear everybody has gaps, right? I'm not saying we need to be perfect, but the same way that our compliance program is evolving, our security program needs to evolve too, and that means that we need to address the cybersecurity risks themselves, not just the compliance requirement that's written down on a piece of paper that we need to hit. Each one of these things exists to address the cybersecurity risk. And finally, your next step should revolve around security in this case. We should go ask our security program or our security team, how are we addressing these top 5 TTPs? Because these are the things that hackers are going to try. These are the things that we try every time we get on your network. If you are the security team, if you are the security person, you should try it right now, right? Go out and try these attacks. None of them are going to break anything. These are features that are built into your Active Directory environment. And lastly, if you haven't had a penetration test, this is a great way to identify risks agnostic of a security framework, right? Hackers don't care about your SPRS score. They don't care about what's on your POEM and what's not. The only thing that they care about is getting access to the data. And organizations that undergo penetration tests and identify these risks have a stronger compliance program for it. That's all I got.